An old apartment building in the city center, built in the 1960s. Apartment 7B is small, but it offers a compelling view of the city skyline, perfect for Arthur's photos. However, there is one room in the apartment that seems to distort the space around it. The walls bear faint, ever-changing marks that seem to mirror the emotions of anyone who enters. The neighbors avoid speaking of it, their eyes darkening whenever the subject arises, as though they know more than they dare to share. Arthur was seeking a fresh start. After a tumultuous year filled with personal losses and financial hardships, he hoped this small apartment would be a place of solace, a refuge where he could focus on his work and regain control of his life. The building itself had a certain charm. Its chipped paint and narrow hallways whispered stories of forgotten decades. The air was thick with a scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like a memory of blood long dried. As Arthur entered the apartment for the first time, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The place felt alive, as if it was waiting for him. The landlord, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, had handed over the keys with little ceremony. He avoided meeting Arthur's gaze when mentioning the back room. "It's just storage," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, but his hand trembled as he pointed out. Arthur didn't pay much attention then, but later that night, as he unpacked his belongings, he noticed something peculiar about that room. It seemed darker than the rest of the apartment, even with the lights on. The air felt heavier, oppressive, like a weight pressing on his chest whenever he approached the door. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened the door slowly, its hinges groaning as though in protest. The room was small, just 4 walls and a single window facing the alley. Yet as Arthur stepped inside, he felt disoriented, as if the dimensions of the room were shifting. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, patterned with flowers that seemed to writhe in the dim light. He could swear the pattern moved whenever he looked away, as if the flowers twisted and decayed before his eyes, only to return to their original form when he focused. The first night was restless. Arthur lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the unease that settled deep in his bones. He heard noises, faint whispers echoing from the back room, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder it became, like the room was calling to him. When he finally drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of the room. In his dream, the walls were covered in mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of himself. Some familiar, others twisted, their eyes hollow and accusing. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if he was still dreaming. The door to the back room was open, though he distinctly remembered closing it. The darkness inside seemed to spill out, creeping into the hallway like an ink stain, and in the dim morning light, he thought he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, watching him. When he blinked, it was gone, but the sense of being watched lingered. As Arthur stepped into the room once more, he noticed something he hadn't before. Faint scratch marks along the floorboards, as if someone or something had been clawing to get out. The air was colder now, and the metallic scent was stronger, almost suffocating. He felt a chill run down his spine, a primal fear that told him to leave, to never return. But he couldn't look away. Something in that room was calling to him, and Arthur knew deep down that whatever secrets this place held, they were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Have you ever stepped into a room that seemed to know you better than you knew yourself? A place that feels like it's breathing, waiting for you, and feeding off your deepest fears? Arthur thought he found a refuge in this new apartment, but what he stumbled upon was a nightmare that would soon blur the lines between reality and illusion. And now, the real question is, will he ever find his way out? If you want to discover the dark secrets behind Arthur's terrifying experience, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. It helps us keep uncovering these chilling stories for you. Arthur was unpacking when the unease of the back room became impossible to ignore. The landlord's hesitant warning echoed in his mind, but curiosity pushed him forward. He had always prided himself on his rationality, dismissing the idea of hauntings or spirits. Yet, something about that room gnawed at his instincts. As he stood at the threshold, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching, an invisible presence observing his every move. He pushed the door open again, this time armed with a flashlight. The room was mostly empty, aside from an old chair in the corner, one he hadn't noticed before. Its worn wood and fraying fabric looked oddly familiar, triggering a vague, uncomfortable memory he couldn't place. When he shone the flashlight across the walls, the faded flower patterns seemed to shift, morphing into twisted shapes, like thorny vines creeping up towards the ceiling. The beam of light trembled as his hand shook, his own fear becoming more palpable with each passing second. Arthur decided to turn on the light switch, but when he did, the bulb flickered before plunging the room into darkness once again, leaving only the narrow beam of his flashlight. He could swear the air grew colder, as if the warmth was being sucked out by some unseen force. A soft noise caught his attention. It sounded like whispering, faint and barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the room, perhaps even from the walls themselves. The whispers were fragmented, like multiple voices speaking in unison, but Arthur couldn't understand what they were saying. It was as if they were talking about him, discussing his presence there, mocking his fear. He took a step further, and the floor creaked beneath his feet, a deep, echoing groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire apartment. The flashlight flickered for a brief moment, and in that split second, Arthur caught sight of something in the corner, a dark figure, tall and gaunt, barely more than a shadow. Its presence was like a stain against the wall, but when the light steadied, it was gone. The chair was empty, the corner devoid of anything but darkness. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to leave, but he stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of dread and curiosity. Arthur tried to rationalize what he saw, blaming it on exhaustion, on the stress of moving, but deep down, he knew there was something wrong with that room. He closed the door firmly behind him, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever lurked in there contained. But even as he walked away, he could feel a chill radiating from the other side, the whispers continuing, muffled now, but persistent, as if the room was whispering secrets it refused to share with him. He sat in the living room, trying to focus on his work, but the sensation of being watched wouldn't leave. The apartment, which had seemed so promising, now felt hostile, oppressive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch towards him, and every small sound, the creak of a pipe, the distant hum of traffic, seemed amplified, like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. The door to the back room creaked slightly, as if being pushed by an unseen hand. Arthur turned to look, his heart skipping a beat. It was ajar again. He distinctly remembered closing it, even locking it. He got up, a cold sweat trickling down his back, and approached the door slowly. It felt like each step was taking him deeper into some unseen abyss. As he reached the door, he heard something that made his blood run cold. His own name, whispered softly from within the dark of the room. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a plea, almost a taunt, the syllables drawn out, as though whatever was inside knew him intimately, knew his fears, and was calling him to face them. Arthur shut the door with force, his hand trembling as he locked it again. He stepped back, staring at the door, waiting to see if it would move again. Nothing. Silence. Only the pounding of his own heart echoed in his ears. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, that he was letting his imagination get the better of him. But he knew in the pit of his stomach that the back room was different. It was alive, and it wanted something from him. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The first night after unpacking was a sleepless one for Arthur. The oppressive weight of the back room seemed to seep through the apartment, its presence lingering even with the door firmly shut. He tried to shake it off, focusing on editing some photos on his laptop, but his attention kept drifting back. It was like a subtle, inaudible call, an itch he couldn't quite scratch, a pressure in the back of his mind that urged him to return. As the hours ticked by, exhaustion finally claimed him, and Arthur drifted into a restless sleep on the couch. The darkness in his dreams was thick, like ink, swallowing all light and sound. He found himself standing in the back room, but it was different now. The walls were no longer lined with faded wallpaper. Instead, They were covered in what looked like an endless number of mirrors, each reflecting a different version of the room, some with twisted angles, others with eerie shadows lurking in the corners. In one mirror, Arthur saw himself, standing in the middle of the room, but his reflection wasn't quite right. His eyes were dark, hollow, and there was a strange grin stretching across his face, one that he knew he would never make. Suddenly, the mirrors began to shatter, one by one, the sound echoing around him, piercing his ears. The glass fell, but never hit the ground. It simply dissolved into darkness before it could reach his feet. Arthur turned, desperate to find a way out, but the door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. The only thing left was the chair, now positioned in the center of the room. On it sat a figure, a silhouette of a man, head bowed, hands resting on his knees. Arthur could feel his breath quicken, his chest tightening with dread. He took a step forward, compelled by some unknown force, and the figure slowly raised its head. The face was his own, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, as if they were voids that led to nothing but despair. The reflection smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of the lips, and whispered something Arthur couldn't understand. The voice was layered, as though a dozen mouths spoke at once, each with a different inflection. He strained to hear, stepping closer, and the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a grip like iron. Arthur felt a jolt, as if electricity had surged through him, and in an instant he was falling backward into darkness, the room, the figure, and the shattered mirrors disappearing into the void. Arthur woke with a start, heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. It took him a moment to remember where he was, the dim light of dawn barely illuminating the edges of the living room. He glanced towards a hallway, towards a back room, and felt his stomach drop. The door was wide open. He knew he had locked it before he went to sleep. Slowly he got up, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and approached the door. The air around it was freezing, and as he peered inside, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The room was as he left it, the old chair in the corner, the faded wallpaper. But now, there was something new. On the wall opposite the door, etched into the wallpaper, were deep scratches, like claw marks, arranged in a chaotic pattern. Arthur stepped inside, his breath visible in the cold air. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the grooves, and a chill ran down his spine. The marks formed a shape, a crude, almost childlike depiction of a face. His face. He stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. As he picked it up, the light flickered across the chair, and for a brief moment, Arthur saw it again, the dark figure sitting there, head bowed, just like in his dream. He blinked, and it was gone, the chair empty once more. The whispers started again, low and insistent, coming from all around him, though there was no one there. They spoke his name, over and over, each time more urgent, more demanding. Arthur backed out of the room, slamming the door shut and locking it, his hands trembling. He could still hear the whispers, muffled now but relentless, a chorus of voices that seemed to know him, to know his fears, his regrets. He pressed his ear against the door, trying to make sense of the words, and suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, clear voice, his own. "You can't hide from it, Arthur," it said, the tone almost mocking. He stumbled back, the silence now more terrifying than the whispers had been. He sat down on the floor of the hallway, staring at the door, his mind racing. Was he losing his sanity? Was this just the stress, the exhaustion playing tricks on him? But deep down, Arthur knew it was something more. The room was alive, it was aware, and it wanted something from him. The line between his dreams and reality was beginning to blur, and he feared it soon. He wouldn't be able to tell the difference at all. Arthur couldn't avoid the room forever. Something in it seemed to pull at him, a dark gravity that gripped his thoughts and refused to let go. Each time he passed the hallway, he found his gaze drifting to the door, his heart pounding in his chest as he remembered the whispers, the face scratched into the wall. On the third night, As the sun dipped below the horizon and the apartment was swallowed by shadows, Arthur decided he had to confront it. He couldn't live like this, haunted, terrified of a room in his own home. He needed answers. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door, flashlight ready. The cold was immediate, wrapping around him like icy fingers as he pushed the door open. The light from the hallway spilled inside, illuminating the small space that seemed, somehow, to be darker than before. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. He shut the door behind him, sealing himself in the darkness, and turned on his flashlight. The chair in the corner seemed to stare back at him, an inanimate yet undeniably sinister presence. The walls, once covered in faded flowers, were now bare, the wallpaper peeled back to reveal something beneath, a series of black marks, symbols that twisted and turned, pulsing slightly as if alive. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He could feel something watching him, something that lurked just beyond the edges of the light, hidden in the shadows that pooled at the corners of the room. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. He tapped it, a sense of dread washing over him as the beam grew weaker. Then, without warning, the light went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Arthur's heart raced, each thump echoing in his ears as he stood frozen, his eyes wide, struggling to adjust. The cold seemed to deepen, biting through his skin, and the whispers began again, soft, insistent, coming from all around him, growing louder with each passing second. His name, over and over, like a chant, a summons that he felt in the pit of his stomach. In the pitch black of the room, Arthur could make out shapes moving, dark, shifting figures that glided across the walls, closing in on him. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled back, his hand groping for the door handle. But it was gone. He turned, his fingers brushing against the wall, but it was smooth, featureless, as though the door had never existed. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, a cacophony of voices that surrounded him, pressing in from every direction. He could hear his own voice among them, mocking, taunting, telling him there was no escape. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low creak, like the groan of old wood under pressure. Arthur turned towards the source, and there, in the corner, the chair was no longer empty. The figure sat there, head bowed, its face obscured by shadow. Arthur's mouth went dry, his body paralyzed with fear as the figure slowly lifted its head, revealing his own face, pale, eyes hollow and black, lips curled in a cruel, knowing smile. It raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and Arthur felt a cold wave of terror crash over him, freezing him in place. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing in the darkness. "You can't run from it, Arthur," it said. "You belong here." The figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing in the empty room. Arthur backed away, his eyes wide, his heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening, pressing against him, suffocating. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, and suddenly, he was falling backward, the room, the figure, the whispers all spiraling away as he plunged into a void of nothingness. He landed hard, his body jolted by the impact. The air was knocked from his lungs, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Slowly, his vision cleared, and he found himself lying on the floor of the back room. The chair was empty again, the walls covered once more in their faded wallpaper. The door was wide open, the warm light from the hallway spilling inside, casting long shadows across the floor. Arthur pushed himself up, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced around, his eyes wide, but everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. He could feel it deep inside, a cold, creeping fear that told him he hadn't truly escaped. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the door, his hand gripping the handle. As he stepped out into the hallway, He glanced back at the room one last time, and for a brief moment, he saw it again. A dark figure standing in the corner, watching him, its hollow eyes locked on his. He blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Arthur shut the door, locking it tight, his hand lingering on the cold metal handle. He knew now that the room wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had a hold on him. The whispers, the darkness, the figure that wore his face, they were all part of it, part of him. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he knew the truth. The room would always be there, waiting, calling to him, drawing him back into its cold embrace. The line between his dreams and reality had blurred, and Arthur feared that soon there would be no difference at all. Arthur woke the next morning with the unsettling feeling that the nightmare had not ended when he opened his eyes. He felt the coldness of the back room deep in his bones, as if it had seeped into his very soul. Determined to understand what was happening, he decided to investigate. There had to be an explanation, a logical reason behind the hallucinations, the whispers, the figure. Maybe it was something simple, a gas leak, a structural issue with the building. Anything would be better than admitting to himself that the impossible might be real. His first stop was the building's management office. The landlord, Mr. Carvalho, was an elusive man, always hurrying away with little to no conversation. When Arthur found him, the man's demeanor changed visibly at the mention of the back room. His eyes widened, and a nervous twitch appeared at the corner of his mouth. He tried to dismiss Arthur's concerns with vague reassurances, but Arthur pressed him, his frustration boiling over. Finally, Mr. Carvalho sighed, his gaze shifting away as if he were speaking to a ghost. "There's nothing for you there," he muttered, almost too quietly to hear. "That room, it's seen things, bad things. You should just leave it alone." He wouldn't say more, leaving Arthur with more questions than answers. What could have happened in that room to make the landlord so fearful? Arthur knew he couldn't just ignore this. It was like a puzzle, and he needed to see the full picture. That night, Arthur began searching through old records, combing through whatever information he could find about the building and its past tenants. He spent hours in dimly lit archives and browsing online forums, hoping for a clue. What he found was chilling. Reports of previous tenants who had lived in his apartment, people who had claimed to experience strange phenomena. Their stories mirrored his own. Whispers in the dark, doors opening on their own, figures that lurked just out of sight. The most disturbing report was of a woman, a tenant from years ago, who had vanished without a trace. The police had found her belongings still in the apartment, her last diary entry scrawled with the words, "It's in the room. It wants me. I can't escape." Arthur's blood ran cold as he read the account, his eyes glued to the chilling handwriting of someone who had been in his exact situation. The more he read, the clearer it became. Whatever haunted the back room had been there for decades, and it had taken others before him. But why? Why was it doing this? What did it want? The questions gnawed at his mind, and he realized with a growing sense of dread that he needed to know the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. The next day, Arthur found himself drawn back to the room. He hesitated at the door, his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew he had to go in. He needed to face whatever was inside. Slowly, he opened the door, the cold air washing over him once again. The room looked the same, small, unassuming, almost mundane. But there was something different now, a new detail that sent a shiver down his spine. On the wall, where the claw marks had been, something had appeared, a symbol roughly etched, a circle with lines radiating outward like a twisted sun. He had seen it before, in the old records, drawn on the edges of the missing woman's diary. He stepped closer, his fingers tracing the jagged lines. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, a low, vibrating sound that grew louder the closer he got. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, until they were a chorus of voices echoing around him. They were different now, more insistent, more demanding. They spoke of loss, of pain, of things hidden in the dark. And then, among the cacophony, a single voice emerged, distinct and clear. It was his mother's voice, calling his name, the way she used to when he was a child. lost in the aisles of a store. The sound cut through him, filled him with a hollow, aching fear. Arthur's knees weakened, and he stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick, his mind playing on his fears. But the voice was so real, so unmistakably hers. The whispers seemed to laugh now, taunting him, and the symbol on the wall seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim room. He had to get out. He turned, reaching for the door, but it slammed shut before he could touch it, the noise deafening in the confined space. He was trapped. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, his breath visible in the icy air. The shadows in the room deepened, growing and shifting until they seemed to take form. In the corner, the figure reappeared, taller now, its presence overwhelming, filling the room with a sense of crushing dread. It stepped forward, and Arthur saw his own face staring back at him, but twisted, the eyes dark and empty, the mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected only his worst fears, his darkest regrets. Arthur's voice trembled as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer, but it reached out, pointing to the symbol on the wall. Arthur turned to look, and the lines began to shift, rearranging themselves, forming words. They spelled out a message. "You must remember." Remember what? Arthur's mind raced, fragments of memories flashing through his mind. His childhood, his mother's death, the years of pain he had tried to bury. Was that what the room wanted? Was it feeding off his grief, his fear? He turned back to the figure, but it was gone. The room suddenly silent. The whispers vanished as if they had never been there. The door creaked open, and Arthur stumbled out, his legs barely able to support him. He collapsed against the hallway wall, his body shaking, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He knew now that the room was more than just haunted. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of himself, forcing him to confront what he had tried so hard to forget. But there was something else, something more sinister, lurking beneath the surface. The message, the symbol, the voices, they were all part of something much bigger, something that Arthur feared he was only beginning to understand. He looked back at the door, now closed once again, and he knew that this was far from over. The room wanted something from him, something he wasn't sure he could give. And as he sat there, the cold of the back room still clinging to his skin, Arthur realized that the nightmare had only just begun. Arthur's life began to unravel, his days blending into nights, the world outside his apartment growing distant and surreal. He could no longer tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. The whispers from the back room echoed in his mind, even when he was out in the daylight, as if they had taken root inside his consciousness. He had to find out what was happening, why the room seemed to know his secrets, why it wanted him. And more importantly, what did it mean by "you must remember"? Desperation drove Arthur deeper into the building's history. He visited the city archives, spending hours hunched over dusty records, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. The building was older than he initially thought, its history steeped in tragedy and mystery. There were multiple reports of tenants disappearing without a trace, their apartments left untouched, as if they had simply walked out one day and never returned. Each of them had lived in his apartment, and all had complained of the same thing: a room that seemed to breathe, that whispered in the night, that knew their darkest fears. It was during one of these late nights that Arthur found a lead, an old newspaper article from decades ago. It spoke of a man named Tomas Valente, an occultist who had lived in the building, rumored to have been conducting strange rituals. He had disappeared suddenly, leaving behind only a series of symbols etched into the walls of his apartment, symbols that matched the ones in Arthur's back room. The article mentioned Tomas's belief that the building was a conduit, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the living could reach out and touch the unknown. Arthur knew he had to learn more, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He reached out to a neighbor he had seen a few times in the hallway, a woman named Clara. She had lived in the building for years and seemed to know more about its secrets than she let on. Arthur knocked on her door late one evening, and when she opened it, her eyes widened with a mix of recognition and fear. "You've been in the room, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze darting towards his apartment. Arthur nodded, and she sighed, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was cluttered, filled with books and papers, old photographs pinned to the walls. She gestured for him to sit, and Arthur could see the tension in her shoulders, the fear in her eyes as she spoke. "That room," Clara began, her voice trembling. "It's not just a place. It's a gateway. Tomas Valente believed it was a portal to something beyond our understanding, a place that fed on the fears and regrets of those who entered. He tried to control it, to use it, but he failed. The room took him, just like it's taken others." She paused, her eyes locking onto Arthur's. "It knows you, Arthur. It knows what you're hiding, what you've tried to forget, and it will use it against you." Arthur felt a chill run through him, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a vice. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice cracking. Clara shook her head, her expression one of sorrow. "You have to face it. Whatever it's showing you, whatever memory it's dredging up, you have to confront it. It's the only way to break free." That night, Arthur returned to his apartment, Clara's words echoing in his mind. He stood outside the back room, the door shut, the air around it colder than the rest of the apartment. He knew what he had to do. He opened the door and stepped inside, the darkness enveloping him immediately. The whispers began again, soft and insistent, his name repeated over and over, calling to him, urging him to remember. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls bending, the ceiling stretching higher. The air grew thick, and Arthur felt his chest tighten, his breathing becoming labored. He closed his eyes, letting the whispers guide him, and suddenly he was no longer in the room. He was back in his childhood home, the scent of his mother's perfume filling the air, the sound of her laughter echoing from another room. Arthur's heart ached, a deep, throbbing pain that brought tears to his eyes. He saw her, standing in the kitchen, her back turned to him, her hair tied up the way she always wore it. "Mom," he called, his voice breaking. She turned, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, her skin pale and lifeless. She raised a hand, pointing at him, her voice a chorus of whispers. "You left me, Arthur. You forgot." Arthur stumbled back, his hand shaking, the room shifting once more. The walls of his childhood home melted away, replaced by the cold, dark walls of the back room. The whispers grew louder, the symbols on the wall glowing faintly, the shadows closing in around him. Arthur fell to his knees, his body trembling, tears streaming down his face. He knew what the room wanted, his guilt, his regret. He had left his mother when she was sick, unable to face her decline, unable to bear the pain of watching her fade away. He had run, and she had died alone. The room was forcing him to face that truth, to confront the part of himself he had buried deep inside. The figure appeared again, stepping out of the shadows, its hollow eyes locked onto Arthur's. "You must remember," it whispered, its voice echoing in the darkness. Arthur closed his eyes, the pain overwhelming, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it all, the guilt, the sorrow, the fear. He let it wash over him, the memories flooding his mind, and as he did, the whispers began to fade. The air grew warmer, the shadows receding, the figure dissolving into nothingness. Arthur opened his eyes, and the room was empty. The symbols on the wall had faded, the cold gone, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful silence. He stood, his legs weak, his body exhausted, and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. He knew it wasn't over, not yet, but he had taken the first step. He had faced the truth, and though the room still held its secrets, he was no longer afraid. As he sat in the dim light of his living room, Arthur knew that whatever lay beyond that door, whatever darkness awaited him, he would face it. He had to, because the only way to escape the nightmare was to confront it, to remember, and to finally let go. Arthur knew the time had come to confront whatever was inside the back room once and for all. The whispers had returned, growing louder each night, more aggressive, calling to him, demanding his attention. He felt the weight of them pressing on his mind even during the day, like a presence that never left his side, a shadow that followed him everywhere. He was exhausted, his body weakened, his mind fraying at the edges, but he knew he couldn't keep running. He had to end this, one way or another. That night, Arthur prepared himself. He gathered what little courage he had left, armed with a flashlight, a notebook filled with the symbols he had studied, and Clara's warning echoing in his ears. Face it, or it will consume you. He stood before the door, the cold radiating from the wood, his hand hovering over the handle. With a deep breath, he pushed it open, stepping into the darkness, feeling it swallow him whole. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. The air turned frigid, the temperature dropping rapidly, and Arthur's breath became visible in the dim light of his flashlight. The whispers returned, but now they were different, no longer distant, but close, surrounding him, coming from every direction at once. He heard his name, heard the voices of people long gone, his mother, the woman who had vanished years ago, and even Tomas Valente, the occultist. They spoke of pain, of despair, their words a twisted cacophony that made Arthur's skin crawl. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and Arthur found himself in complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, the sound like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, forming a wall of noise that pressed against him, crushing him. He could feel the room shifting around him, the walls moving closer, the ceiling lowering, as if the room was alive and trying to swallow him. He stumbled backward, his hands searching for the door, but it was gone. He was trapped. The symbols on the wall began to glow, a faint, eerie light that cast long, twisted shadows across the room. Arthur turned, and there, in the center of the room, was the figure. It was him, but not him. A dark reflection, twisted and monstrous, its eyes hollow and filled with darkness, its mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and Arthur felt his heart pound in his chest, fear gripping him so tightly he could barely breathe. The figure spoke, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to come from the very walls. "You cannot run from what you are, Arthur," it said, the words vibrating in the cold air. "You must accept it. You must face the darkness within." The figure reached out, its hand extending towards Arthur, and he felt a pull, a force dragging him closer, his feet sliding across the floor against his will. He fought it, his body trembling, his mind screaming for him to resist, but the force was too strong. Arthur's back hit the wall, the symbols glowing brighter, burning into his skin, searing his flesh. He cried out in pain, his hands clawing at the wall, trying to push himself away. But there was no escape. The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes staring into his, and Arthur felt something shift inside him. A memory, a moment he had tried so hard to forget. He saw his mother, lying in her hospital bed, her eyes filled with sadness, with disappointment, as he walked away. He had left her, abandoned her when she needed him most, and the guilt had followed him ever since, festering, growing, becoming a part of him. The figure smiled, its twisted lips parting to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and Arthur knew what it was. It was his fear, his regret, his guilt made manifest. It was everything he had tried to run from, everything he had buried deep inside, and now it had come for him. He felt the tears spill down his cheeks, the pain of that memory overwhelming, suffocating, but he knew he couldn't keep running. He had to face it, had to accept what he had done. With a trembling breath, Arthur closed his eyes, letting the tears fall, and spoke. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking, the words barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "I'm sorry I left you. I was scared. I couldn't watch you suffer. I was weak." The moment the words left his lips, the room seemed to shudder, the air vibrating, the whispers growing silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The figure stopped, its hand still extended, but the pull had lessened. Arthur opened his eyes, meeting the hollow gaze of his dark reflection, and spoke again, louder this time, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not running anymore. I accept it. I accept what I did. I won't let you control me." The figure's smile faded, its form beginning to dissolve, the darkness peeling away like smoke, leaving nothing behind but a faint shadow on the wall. The symbols dimmed, their glow fading until they were nothing more than scratches in the plaster. The cold in the room lifted, the air warming, and Arthur felt a weight leave his chest, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He pushed himself away from the wall, his body trembling, and turned towards the door. It was there again, the handle within reach. Arthur walked to it, his heart pounding, and opened the door, stepping out of the room, leaving the darkness behind. He collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, his body shaking, tears still streaming down his face. But this time, they were tears of release. He had faced his fear, had confronted the darkness that had haunted him for so long, and he had survived. The whispers were gone, the cold had lifted, and the back room was silent. Just a room once more. Arthur knew it wasn't truly over. There would always be shadows, always be fears that lingered, but he had taken the first step. He had faced the truth, and in doing so, had taken back control. He looked at the closed door of the back room, a sense of calm washing over him, and knew that whatever came next he would be ready. The darkness had lost its power over him, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt free. Arthur had faced the darkness of the back room and come out the other side, but the atmosphere in the apartment remained changed. There was a stillness that seemed unnatural, a quiet that felt almost too perfect, as if the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The door to the back room was closed now, and Arthur made sure it stayed that way. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had confronted wasn't gone for good. It was still there, lying dormant, biding its time. As he moved through his apartment, Arthur felt a strange disconnection from his surroundings. The walls seemed unfamiliar, the air heavier than before, as if the room itself had somehow shifted after the confrontation. He looked at the door to the back room, that was scratched and worn, and thought about everything he had seen. The whispers, the figure that had worn his face, the twisted reflection of his own guilt and fear. He had faced it, accepted it, but deep down, he knew that the room still had more secrets. One night, just as Arthur was about to fall asleep on the couch, he heard it, the unmistakable creak of the back room door. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest as he sat up, staring down the hallway. The door was ajar, just a crack, but enough for the darkness to seep through. He felt the cold radiate out from the opening, a chill that seemed to sink into his bones. Slowly, he stood, his feet carrying him towards the door before his mind could tell him to stop. He reached out, his hand brushing against the wood, and pushed it open. The room was empty, just as he had left it, but something was different. The air felt charged, almost electric, and there was a faint glow coming from the far corner of the room, a shimmer that Arthur hadn't noticed before. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest, and approached the corner. There, on the floor, lay a small, crumpled piece of paper, glowing faintly in the dim light. Arthur knelt down, his fingers trembling as he picked up. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and covered in symbols. Symbols that matched the ones that had once glowed on the walls. But there was something else. A drawing, crude but unmistakable. It was a door, slightly ajar, and behind it, two eyes, watching. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it meant. The room wasn't done with him. There were more layers to its darkness, more secrets hidden within its depths, waiting to be uncovered. He backed out of the room, shutting the door quickly, his hands shaking as he turned the lock. He had thought it was over, that he had faced his fears and won, but the room had more to show him. It wanted more from him. Arthur sat down on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wall, staring at the closed door, a sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. What did the room want? Why had it chosen him? He could feel it, a pull deep inside, a whisper that called to him even now, urging him to open the door once more and step inside. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, in fear of what lay behind that door, in constant uncertainty. He had to make a choice. He could leave, abandon the apartment, try to outrun whatever haunted him, but he knew that wouldn't work. The room, the darkness, the whispers, they were a part of him now, and no matter how far he ran, they would always be there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. The other option was to face it again, to open the door and confront whatever lay beyond, to delve deeper into the mystery that had ensnared him. Arthur's eyes lingered on the door, the silence of the apartment pressing down on him, and he knew that the story wasn't over. There was more to discover, more to fear, and perhaps more to understand. The room was a gateway, a conduit, and Arthur had only just begun to scratch the surface of its secrets. He stood, his hand hovering over the door handle, his heart racing. Did he dare open it? Did he dare face what lay beyond? Before he could make a decision, a sound echoed through the apartment, a whisper, soft and distant, coming from behind the door. Arthur's breath caught, his pulse quickening as he listened. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and this time, it wasn't his name. It was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. A single word, repeated over and over, a word that filled him with dread. Remember. Arthur stepped back, his hand dropping from the handle, his eyes wide. The door remained closed, the whisper fading into silence, but the word echoed in his mind, a reminder that whatever lay in the room was far from finished with him. He turned away, his body trembling, and walked back to the living room, his mind racing with questions. What was it that he needed to remember? What was the room trying to show him? And would he ever truly escape its grip? The apartment was quiet once more, the darkness settling in, but Arthur knew that the peace was temporary. The room would call to him again, and next time, he might not be able to resist. He looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, and felt a sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world outside. Whatever happened next, he would face it alone, with only the darkness and the whispers to keep him company. Arthur knew that this was just the beginning. The mystery of the back room was far from solved, and the terror it held still lingered, waiting for the moment when he would open that door once again. Until then, he would live in suspense, in fear of what lay beyond, and in the hope that one day he might finally understand the truth. What do you think lies beyond the door of the back room? Do you think Arthur will ever find a way to escape its grasp, or is he doomed to be haunted by its secrets forever? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The back room still holds its mysteries, and perhaps, someday, we will uncover them together.